Good morning. On behalf of the Atlantic Council and the Embassy of the Republic of Estonia to the United States, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, NATO Membership and Security Guarantees, Getting Ukraine Right at the Vilnius Summit. My name is Matthew Kranig, and I'm Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Since Putin began his unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, brave Ukrainians have defied unrelenting assaults on their homeland. Support from the North Atlantic Alliance and its member states has been crucial for Ukraine's resilience over the last year and a half, but allies can do more than provide humanitarian aid and military equipment at the NATO summit in Vilnius this July. To position Ukraine for success in its war with Russia, protect the country's security in the long term, NATO should revisit the question of Ukraine's long-promised membership in the alliance at the summit. NATO's ability to realize the promises made at the 2008 Bucharest summit will be imperative to secure Ukraine for the long term, deter future Russian aggression, and strengthen European security. With the NATO summit approaching in just 4 short weeks, today's discussion will consider how NATO leaders and decision-makers should address Ukraine's future in the alliance when they convene in Vilnius, security guarantees they may offer pending Ukraine's entry, and the resulting impact on Ukraine and NATO's collective security beyond the end of the war. Convenings such as this are integral to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. The Center honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. The Scowcroft Center's Transatlantic Security Initiative, the host of today's event, seeks to shape and influence the debate on the greatest security challenges facing the North Atlantic Alliance and its key partners. In this spirit, we convene today's event to offer several recommendations for the transatlantic community of decision-makers on a long-avoided question, Ukraine's membership in the NATO alliance. This discussion comes as part of our broader campaign of analysis and programming to prepare for the historic NATO summit this July. On the sidelines of the summit, the Atlantic Council is proud to co-host the NATO Public Forum in partnership with NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, the Eastern Europe Studies Center, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and the Munich Security Conference. Please stay tuned for more from us on this important event in the coming weeks. Today's event will feature a discussion with an excellent group of panelists, Franklin D. Kramer, Distinguished Fellow and Board Member at the Atlantic Council, former Assistant Secretary of Defense, and co-author alongside Hans Benedijk of our recent report, Providing Long-Term Security for Ukraine, NATO Membership, and Other Security Options. We're also delighted to welcome Ambassador Kailike Celeste Elling, the Republic of Estonia's Undersecretary for Political Affairs, General James Jones, President and founder of Jones Group International, Executive Chairman Emeritus of the Atlantic Council, the former National Security Advisor to the President of the United States, and Christopher Socha, Minority Staff Director at the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Transatlantic Security Initiative Deputy Director Leah Schoenemann will moderate the conversation, which will examine the range of security options up for consideration in Vilnius. We encourage our in-person and virtual participants to join the conversation as well. There will be time for questions after the panel discussion, and we encourage you to interact with us on Twitter by following @Atlantic Council and using our hashtag #StrongerWithAllies. Before we begin, we're very pleased to host today's event in partnership with the Embassy of the Republic of Estonia to the United States. I would especially like to thank Ambassador Christian Preek and his team for their support. And with that, I'd like to now turn things over to Leah to get the discussion started. Leah, over to you.
Great, thank you, Matt, for that kind introduction. I'm very excited to be having the conversation here today at the Atlantic Council. My name is Leah Schoenemann, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Transatlantic Security Initiative here at the Atlantic Council, where we lead our programming focused on NATO and are especially gearing up to the NATO Vilnius Summit in just 4 short weeks. With the NATO summit approaching in less than a month, we are honored to host today's event to discuss a particular issue on the front of the agenda in Vilnius, which is the issue of solutions for securing Ukraine and advancing the country towards a NATO membership before the transatlantic decision makers convene in Vilnius. We recently published a new issue brief providing long-term security for Ukraine, NATO membership, and other security options. authored by Atlantic Council Distinguished Fellow Dr. Hans Benedijk and Atlantic Council Board Director and Distinguished Fellow Frank Kramer. Their report aims to advance the public conversation on Ukraine's future relationship with NATO and suggests a variety of possible options for transatlantic decision makers to consider at Vilnius. So I'm excited to be joined by 4 distinguished guests today, and we have 3 of them in person and 1 joining virtually. So first, but definitely not to be forgotten as well, our co-author, Dr. Hans Benedijk, who wasn't able to join us today, but we are happy to have Mr. Franklin Kramer here representing the report that we've just authored, or just published, sorry. Frank, you have served as a senior political appointee in 2 administrations, including at the level of Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs at the Department of Defense, where you had purview over all international policy, as far as I can tell, including NATO in Europe and Russia. And you've been working on a whole host of other political, military, and defense policy issues since then, including leading a lot of our work on China as well, which I hope to be able to tease out in some of the conversation here. We are also joined in person by Ambassador Kailika Salasti-Ailing, if I'm pronouncing that at all correctly, who serves currently as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Estonia. Kailika has extensive experience on NATO issues, including serving as the Director General on the Department for NATO and Transatlantic Relations at the MFA, as well as the actual permanent representative from Estonia to NATO from 2017 to 2021. And you've been a diplomat since 1996 and have served in a number of many other positions, but we are very pleased to have you joining us in person today. And then we are also honored, and I'm very excited to have Christopher Socha joining us in person as well today. Chris is the Minority Staff Director at the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, who can provide us today, we hope, an important perspective from the U.S. Congress on these issues. Chris has served as the principal advisor for Ranking Member Senator Jim Risch and manages the committee on the senator's behalf. The committee obviously has a very large and extensive portfolio, but I know you're especially focused on issues having to do with strategic competition with China and Russia, support for Ukraine and Taiwan, NATO enlargement, and other issues. And in the past, you have worked on the enlargement processes from the Senate perspective for Croatia and Albania, I think, just to name 2 of the more recent examples. So it's a pleasure to have you with us today, Chris. And then last but not least, we are delighted to have General Jim Jones joining us virtually today. As president of Jones Group International currently, General Jones provides us strategies for navigating the complex nexus of business, international affairs, and public policy. He is also the executive chairman emeritus of the Atlantic Council. And previously, General Jones served as the national security advisor to President Barack Obama, and also had a long career in the U.S. military. And in his 40-year career, he served as the most recently as the commander for U.S. European Command, as well as the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe from 2003 to 2006. With responsibility for 92 countries from Europe, Eurasia, and Africa, he was overseeing many, many issues, as well as serving as also commander of NATO forces in the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, in Afghanistan, which was the largest combat mission in NATO's history. So General Jones has overseen a whole host of other issues, including the military integration of the alliance as it expanded or enlarged from 19 to 26 members. So thank you for joining us today, General Jones. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you here today. I think we would like to kick off an engaging discussion, but I want to be able to speak to our audience briefly as well. You can follow along on social media using the hashtag #StrongerWithAllies. We'll be able to have some audience questions in person here with the microphone over on the other side of the room. And then if you're joining us virtually, you can please submit your questions to our panelists on askac.org. And that will allow us to have some question and answer also coming from the virtual audience that I'll get here on this fancy iPad. So to start us off, I have a very kind of broad opening question, but maybe just to preview, Ukraine's membership in NATO has been on the table for more than 15 years without action from NATO beyond the declaration of the 2008 Bucharest summit, which I know is in headlines very often these days. At the 2008 Bucharest summit, NATO stated that it welcomes Ukraine and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO, and we agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO. Further on in the statement, NATO agreed that today we make clear that we support these countries' applications for MAP, and therefore we will now begin a period of intense engagement on the MAP process. I think we can count maybe the 15 years of conversation since then as part of that process, but there has not been a formal membership action plan provided to Ukraine, which is why we are here today discussing that as an option going into the Vilnius summit. At the summit, allies, I think, must signal their commitment to Euro-Atlantic security and address security guarantees for Ukraine, in addition to increasing the military and other assistance that allies are providing Ukraine. One of the key issues that is on the table is whether or not NATO should extend a membership action plan to Ukraine now or in the future on some set timeline. There are a lot of different permutations of how that could go. So I would like to invite Atlantic Council Board Director and distinguished fellow Frank Kramer to kind of lay a foundation for the discussion based on the report that you've just co-authored with Dr. Hans Binnendijk. So I would ask maybe a very broad question for you first. Can you give us an overview of the different security options that NATO allies could consider at the Vilnius summit? And then which do you think is maybe the best option and then the most likely option?
Right. So first of all, thanks, Leah. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks to all my co-panelists, especially General Jones, who was a former colleague. As you indicated, Hans Binnendijk have done a joint paper, and I think it is useful to underscore it's very much a joint effort. Hans could not be here today, but what you'll hear is a result of a real collaboration. So let me lay out what our thinking was. And I think the first thing to say is that it's important to recognize that we're recommending that NATO establish what I'll call a path to membership, and that we're not recommending immediate membership at Vilnius. But it should be a path that will support Ukraine both in the short term as well as in the long term. And in the words of three European leaders, President Macron of France, Anna Marin of Finland, and Ursula von der Leyen at the European Commission, it's a path that should support what I would call the international rules-based order, the concept of national security. It should support our values, transatlantic values, and it should support Ukraine now and in the future. So those are the broad considerations. And with that, let me lay out the options, and we propose 5. The first option is a fast-track option. That is to say, fast-track to membership for Ukraine without any conditions, but only upon a ceasefire, and a ceasefire that's satisfactory to Ukraine. So this is somewhat comparable to the offer that's been made to Finland and to Sweden, in the sense that if this were accepted, the decision would be Ukraine is ready for membership once a ceasefire occurs. Now, I do underscore the need for a ceasefire. The two broad reasons for this kind of approach would be, on the one hand, providing what I would call security and protection to a population that's fought against aggression and for our values. And secondly, from a military point of view, it actually strengthens the alliance's military capability, because Ukraine has really a highly effective, highly capable military. The second option that Hans and I had in mind was also a fast-track option, but it's one also conditioned on a ceasefire satisfactory to Ukraine, but with some conditions. So yes, pushing security for Ukraine, yes, focusing on values as before, but also seeking some assurances from Ukraine to deal with some important issues for democratic countries. Our suggestion was a focus on a reduction of corruption in the country, an assurance with respect to judicial independence, and protection of minority rights. And those are all important to democracies, and Ukraine is a democracy, but we want to make sure it's a democracy that fits fully within the alliance. Those suggestions that Hans and I made are overlapping, of course, with some of the suggestions or some of the requirements, perhaps, Ukraine will face as it's now has a candidacy with respect to the European Union, and those are some of the issues that the Union is looking at also. So this option would put NATO, so to speak, and the European Union in something of a synchronous approach, which is, since there's so much overlap in membership, I think a good thing to do. The third option, which you've already mentioned actually, Leah, is what I would call a traditional membership action plan. And we've seen those before. Some of our members have worked, some of the panel, I should say, have worked hard on some of these with respect to Croatia and Albania, for example. A membership action plan in some sense is similar to option 2, but it's a much more intense engagement. It's a much more broad engagement. So traditionally, a membership action plan will cover a variety of matters. It'll cover political matters, economic matters, defense military matters, security beyond the military, legal issues, and resources. And there are a whole variety of feedback mechanisms that NATO uses to interact with respect to the candidate country. So individualized meetings, group meetings, meetings at the North Atlantic Council level, establishment of a defense planning process, and technical issues and political issues. So MAP has multiple approaches. It's the broadest look at what's necessary for Ukraine. The fourth area would be some kind of NATO-Ukraine partnership. This area has been, or the suggestion has been made by two of my good friends, Ian Brzezinski and Sandy Vershbow. Sandy, of course, was the former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, among his many other positions. Their emphasis is increasing Ukraine's capacity to defend itself, maybe including NATO providing money from the NATO Common Fund, maybe providing much more advanced weaponry, F-35s perhaps, they weren't specific. But also, and they utilize these words, taking steps to facilitate Ukraine's membership. That could be a mini-MAP approach, so to speak, mini membership action plan. And also, I think they would really like to see some assurances that there would be resources for the necessary reconstruction that Ukraine will have to do once this war is ended. The fifth option is what I call Bucharest Plus. So Bucharest, as you already mentioned, said yes, they will sometime become members. The plus part is a date. And in the memorandum that Hans and I did together, we proposed 2027. And I would underscore 2027 as the outside date. I would actually prefer to see membership sooner. But in any event, Bucharest Plus, yes, you'll become a member, and certainly per the memorandum, 2027. So best option, most realistic option. My personal view actually is a traditional membership action plan is the best. It doesn't set a date, but it does mean that the alliance will be working very closely, very hard with Ukraine on all the issues that Ukraine really needs to deal with. Obviously, or maybe I shouldn't say obviously, but from my perspective, there should be an expectation that those criteria would be met relatively soon. Maybe not tomorrow, but certainly no later than 2027. If we, as NATO, undertook a membership action plan approach, again, that would mean that NATO and the European Union are operating somewhat synchronously. I think that's a good thing. We wouldn't have the exact same timetables. I would expect NATO to be able to extend an offer sooner than the EU, because the EU has more technical requirements than NATO does. But broadly speaking, I think that we could make very good use of a membership action plan. It would cover elements, as I said, beyond the military, the democratic elements that I mentioned, judicial independence, for example, would cover economic elements so that we really had a market economy working, that the influence of the oligarchs would be lessened. And would also be an important signal to two key, what are these days called competitors, but I think I would just call them adversaries, and that is to say both China and Russia. It would be a signal to Russia that we, and by that I mean all the NATO countries, will continue to support Ukraine until it succeeds in this war. And it's a signal to China with respect to the Indo-Pacific as to how the United States and hopefully our allies would deal with any aggression in the Indo-Pacific. So my recommendation is that at Vilnius, the NATO leaders, NATO heads of state, offer a membership action plan to Ukraine. As I said, the memorandum has 5 options. I'm sure some other people can think of alternatives to those. But something needs to be done at Vilnius that goes well beyond what was done at Bucharest. So let me turn it back to you and to the panel, and I'll be delighted to hear what others have to say.
Yeah, and we have a lot to dive into. Maybe just on the 2 first options that you mentioned, which are fast track, no membership action plan. If you could talk a little bit, maybe with your lawyer training especially, is there precedence, but beyond Finland and Sweden joining without a membership action plan, is there precedence for NATO inviting members without a formal MAP process? And then maybe more pertinently, does NATO need a precedence, or can we
Right.
make a new process that is something special for Ukraine, given the very special circumstances that we're in?
Membership action plans are actually made up by a group of us who are in the administration and then with colleagues in other governments.
By made up, you mean policy making?
Policy making, yes, policy making. In the late 90s, we had established, we had decided, broadly speaking, to invite the first three members into NATO, Chechnya, then Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland. We had a active activity called the Enhanced Partnership for Peace, but the Enhanced Partnership, and that was for the other, for many of the other countries in, I'll call it Eastern Europe, as well as some of the other countries in Central Asia. But the Enhanced Partnership for Peace was not a direct pathway to NATO membership. And we thought that we wanted to make clear, both to ourselves and to all those countries, that the first three were not the last three. I remember going to, I can't remember, I think it was Lithuania, but in any event with the then Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, talking about membership, and what he said was not never, but not now. And we wanted to turn the words away from never to yes, it's going to happen. And then, as you know, I believe 2002, the next set of significant number of invitations were offered, and those countries came in 2004, and then subsequently other countries have come in over time. So I think what that indicates is that the countries that came in prior to the late 90s, and for that matter, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland did not have membership action plans. There's no requirement in the NATO treaty that there be something called a membership action plan or anything at all.
Wouldn't hold up in a court of law.
It wouldn't hold up in a court of law. The one requirement is that there be unanimity among the members to allow everyone in. Mm-hmm. And the way it's traditionally been done is if the members agree, then the Secretary General offers the membership according to a statement that's agreed upon by the members in the North Atlantic Council. So there, again, I think a membership action plan is a useful device, but not a required device. Mm-hmm. And the value is to make sure that both NATO understands the country that's coming in, and the country that's coming in understands what's required with respect to NATO. With respect to Finland and Sweden, those two countries have worked so closely over the years, or had worked so closely over the years with NATO, that it's hard to think that they actually needed to learn anything new. We were, you see me putting my hands together. We were, very, very close, maybe not technically allies, but collaborative partners. So I think the issue always is whether or not there's been close enough engagement. And then there's also the political issue. Mm-hmm. And that just politics is a reality, geopolitics, if you want to call it that. And I think it's fair to say that some countries, as yet, are not desirous of having Ukraine immediately in there. They want to take a harder look. So the membership action plan approach allows for that, I put it in quotes, harder look. Mm-hmm. So those are the reasons. Not required, potentially useful, helps resolve some of the geopolitics surrounding an alliance that's now 31, hopefully soon 32 countries, and then with Ukraine, maybe 33.
Okay, that's very helpful, and thank you for tracing all of the options in the paper, which is available online, and we have a few printed copies as well, the QR code that you can scan. I want to open it up with another broad question to the rest of the panelists, and I'll start with you. Kileke, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Yeah, I'm just going to keep trying a new tact each time, I think. There's obviously a lot on the agenda for NATO allies at the Vilnius summit, and this issue of Ukraine is the largest and potentially the most important, but there's also a lot of agreements that are being discussed on increased defense spending, especially new defense planning processes and plans at the NATO summit. But in your opinion, how should the NATO alliance be addressing Ukraine's future relationship with NATO at the summit? And I offer, the floor is yours to provide some, I think, opening remarks too from the Estonian perspective especially, which has been a leader on this issue so far.
Okay, great. And thank you so much for the invitation. And I really welcome today's discussion. I mean, we're 1 month out before the summit. It's very relevant. I think this discussion is going on behind closed doors, but it's also very important that we have these discussions more out in the public. All because we want to reach consensus at the end of the day, and we want the Vilnius summit to be a success, and that means getting unity on key issues. Ukraine is a key issue for Estonia. It's probably the most important issue that we're looking at for Vilnius summit. No doubt about that, I think. So I think the way that we've been approaching it is starting, as you said, from the Bucharest decision, and I couldn't agree more that we need to do something more substantial when it comes to Bucharest. Just repeating the same language for 15 years is not okay. The context is totally different now too. There's war going on, Ukraine's fighting Russia, and we need to take all of that into account. So I think we're looking right now at sort of having a number of deliverables or a package for Ukraine. One thing is the partnership piece, the Ukraine-NATO relationship. How can we upgrade that, make that into something more substantial? So there's talk about making the commission right now into a council, which I think would be fantastic. That's something we strongly support. Then there's the whole issue of practical support and NATO providing Ukraine with non-lethal but practical support. So strengthening that part. But then we come to the political piece. The exactly how do we make sure that Ukraine does actually become one day a member of the alliance? The promises have been made 15 years ago. What we didn't do then, we didn't give them the means to reach that goal. So now we really need to get practical and think of something. And as you mentioned, a path, a process is exactly what we're thinking of right now. I think I sort of think about the map issue. I think it's a little bit, the term maybe is toxic, if I can put it that way, because it's exactly what we didn't give Ukraine 15 years ago. So we would have to rebrand something, I think, separate for Ukraine, something specific. But I think the elements are all there. There are many different ideas, as we just heard, 5 different options. We can think of more. Providing them with that path, I think, is probably the most important thing right now. It would give the Ukrainians hope. And we don't know in a month's time where they will be in this counteroffensive, et cetera, but they certainly, I think, need hope. But it would also be beneficial for us because we don't feel that there can be security and stability in Europe until Ukraine is part of the Euro-Atlantic family. That means NATO membership, and that also means EU membership. But that's not going to happen today or tomorrow, and we know that. It takes time. But let's put them on that path.
That's great and wonderful to hear. General Jones, I'm going to come to you next if you're ready to chime in virtually, and then we'll end with Chris just to keep ping-ponging, I think, back and forth and making sure that General Jones can join the conversation. So same kind of opening question to you, sir. In your opinion, what steps should NATO allies be taking regarding Ukraine at the NATO summit in just 4 short weeks?
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here with such a distinguished panel. And Frank Kramer and I go back many, many years. He's done a remarkable work in producing these 5 options, he and Hans Benedijk. I think one of the things that colors my thinking goes back to when I was National Security Advisor and our first meeting in Moscow with then Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, with President Obama. And the one thing that I walked away from that breakfast meeting, which was supposed to last an hour but went on for a considerably longer period of time, was the inescapable fact of the visceral hatred that Vladimir Putin has for NATO. And he's talked at length about the fact that there was to be a so-called gentleman's agreement that NATO would never expand into the former Warsaw Pact countries. And he believes that, whether it's true or not, and it's manifestly untrue, but he believes that. And so the idea of a NATO country close to the Russian Federation's borders is something that I think must keep him awake at night. I'm certain it does. And the idea of Finland and Sweden becoming NATO members was certainly not what he saw as one of the outcomes of the current time. So, but having said that, I do believe that, and I align myself with Frank's suggestion about the MAP program. I think it's very important that Vilnius, that the Ukrainians walk away with an understanding and a belief that NATO membership is going to happen. I don't know that it's a good idea for it to be a now issue, particularly with the offensive that the Ukrainians are launching. I think this is a critical moment in time. I think that that the Russian occasional threats to escalate the weaponry that's being used in the conflict to tactical nuclear weapons is something that we have to think about in terms of any precipitous action for NATO membership. So I think that there is a path here, and the trick at Vilnius is going to be to convince the Ukrainians that it's going to happen. But I think my belief is it should happen in an orderly process, post-conflict, if possible, and I think that way there's good order and some discipline in what it takes to become a NATO member, because there are some issues in Ukraine that I think the alliance will want some assurances that the path for democracy and rule of law and all of those things that we hold other members to is not going to be pushed aside in favor of the Ukraine. So I think reinforcing the Ukrainian belief that NATO membership is going to happen, watching what happens now in the conflict itself, is, I think, job number one to make sure that the Ukrainians can win this fight. Because if they don't, I think the discussions we're going to have are going to be completely different than the ones we're having now. Thank you.
Great, thank you, General Jones. I think turning to Chris, last but not least, this has obviously been an issue that the Senate would have the role of voting on any potential NATO enlargement, as they did most recently with Sweden and Finland. So from your perspective, especially as you're also watching as the minority staff director on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, in your opinion, what steps do allies need to take regarding Ukraine at the NATO summit?
Well, I'll start off just by giving a disclaimer that I'm not speaking for the committee and its members. This is
or the entire Senate?
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion and conversation regarding these issues, so hopefully I'll reflect a lot of those opinions in it, but this is my thoughts in this regard. Having said that, Ukraine right now is the central security issue for NATO. And therefore, it must be robust on the agenda in terms of both potential membership for Ukraine itself, but a litany of other issues that Ukraine is dealing with right now. There is more that NATO can be doing on the crisis management side, on other things to help coordinate ally action in support of Ukraine that NATO has to some extent been sidelined on. I think there's opportunity to enhance what NATO is doing in that regard. And I think that the conversation about membership is incredibly important as well. I would agree with my colleague, MAP is a toxic word, unfortunately. And so if we can rebrand it, if we can call it intensive dialogue or something else, I think it's very important to move this conversation forward about Ukrainian potential membership. As has been noted here, they are the most combat-tested group of people now within the alliance, outside of potentially the United States and some allies that were in Afghanistan in Iraq. That says something for the strength of the alliance going forward, and we need to consider those types of things. I think in terms of support for Ukraine itself, despite what the media says, there is strong support for Ukraine still on Capitol Hill. And it is unfortunate, but that is the state of the dynamics that are up there. I think the concern that members have is that there still is not a clearly defined end state, i.e. we don't hear people constantly talking about helping Ukraine win. I would love to see that as a statement coming out of Vilnius as well. And I think seeing that and moving in a more rapid pace in terms of training, equipment, and other things to help Ukraine, that would help members say we have a clearly defined end state that we want to see. The perception right now is that we're kind of half in, half out. We move too slow, we don't get capabilities quickly enough to Ukraine, and so while they are doing enormous work in fighting back the Russians, they still don't have the type of support that they need. You have seen that from the Hill, whether it's on F-16s, on tanks, on Javelins, on Stingers, on almost every piece of equipment that we've given, the Hill has called for it sooner than we have actually been willing to give and deliver. And that is something we need to change. And again, that reflects the support that is on the Hill for Ukraine. If we continue to deter ourselves, I think you will start to see some of that support erode. But I think there's, again, a lot of room for NATO to take that next step in leadership here and be able to provide some of that guidance.
That's great, and I definitely want to dive into maybe some of the support options in terms of the materiel support, especially with the news recently on the F-16s. You know, finally, how many months into the conflict? I think I would love to have any of the panelists responding directly to Frank and Hans's brief too, but we can get into that. I think one of the things that you said, Kilike, specifically about the European view on Ukraine becoming a member of the community formally with not just the EU process, but also NATO. Taking a step back, could you provide a perspective as the only European on the panel? But I'd be curious for everyone's thoughts, of course, on what the sense is from the broader European community on the role of Ukraine and Ukraine's future for European security and transatlantic security, and then what does the transatlantic community owe Ukraine, or are Europeans and the United States and Canada already providing enough?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thank you for the question. Of course, Ukraine's security is inextricably linked to our security, to European security. This is an existential issue for us. And that's why we're so focused on making sure that Ukraine, and I agree, doesn't just, that we don't support Ukraine for as long as it takes, but until Ukraine wins. And that's always something we caveat that statement with. Because the other option is just simply too terrible to think about. Ukraine not winning. The consequences for European security would be devastating. Therefore, we need to do everything that we can to support Ukraine. I don't see it as sort of what do we owe them or they owe us. I think it's because it's in our interest to support them. They're fighting for their own existence, for their freedom, but at the same time, they're also fighting for our freedom, our security, our values. So it's not a matter of owing. It just makes sense to be supporting Ukraine. And I think Europe here has done a lot. On the one hand, the European Union has come up with some credible initiatives in a very, very fast pace. If you look at it, in the past year and a half, the EU has acted a lot of initiatives, starting from sort of having this ammunition initiative, but also to doing training for Ukrainians, and incredible, giving a lot of military assistance, which we never would have dreamed about 2 years ago, say. So I think Europe's been doing militarily supporting Ukraine, financially, also on a humanitarian level. My own country has taken in 70,000 Ukrainian refugees, war refugees. That's 5.4% of our population. It's quite substantial. And I mean, I think if you put all of that together, you see the immense effort that Europe has been making to supporting Ukraine. Of course, the United States as well. And I mean, here we all see the packages coming out all the time. And actually, that's, of course, very useful. But I think, as I said before, I think European security and stability is very much dependent on how this war ends. It has to end with a victory for Ukraine. All of our security is at stake.
General Jones, if I could have you join the conversation, I think from more of a military perspective, do you think that it is clear now what the strategic end state is vis-a-vis NATO's policies towards Ukraine and maybe especially the U.S. policies towards Ukraine? Is there agreement on this end state of Ukraine's victory in your assessment?
Well, that's why I mentioned that I think what's going on now on the ground in terms of the war itself, it's too early to come to a conclusion as to how that's going to end. It's extremely important, I think, that the Allies accelerate the shipment of weapons to Ukraine as quickly as possible, and that's been one of the weak points, I think, in our support for Ukraine, is the timing in which the weapons that they need in order to assure victory have been rather slow in coming. So I think it's too early to tell how it's going to end. I think it's very important that Vladimir Putin be convinced that there is no Russian victory at the end of the road here. But I think it's, as I said, I think it's premature right now to say how it's going to end. And that's why I think that a little bit slower pace in NATO accession, but a reinforcement of Vilnius that it is going to happen is also very important.
All right, thank you. And Frank, you want to comment on this too?
I did. I think it's useful to take a look at what happened at the G7 meeting, the 7 large Western economies that met about a month ago, if I recall correctly, at heads of state level. And the wording in that G7 communique, and I know we're getting very specialized when we talk about wording in communiques, but the wording was that the countries each supported Ukraine recovering the entirety of its pre-2014 borders. So that didn't get as much play as I would have thought it should have. And I think it's accurate to say, certainly in the media, and I think to some extent in the way different heads of state and foreign ministers and the like talk about things, that is not as clear as it should be, just like Chris stated. But I think that is a commitment, and I think we should build on that. Secondly, there are some weapons that I think need to be provided. One of the issues for the Russians will be whether or not they can continue to support their forces. And so affecting their logistical capabilities, and I'm jumping over into Jim's arena, but he and I did work together on these kinds of things. So one capability that I think really could make a difference is the so-called ATACMS, which is the long-range artillery, which can reach further into Russia. Now that has the issue of actually, quote, reaching into Russia. But I think we have to recognize that if Ukraine is going to succeed, it has to be able to attack where the Russians are putting their military capabilities. That the fight cannot only be inside of Ukraine, at least that's my personal perspective. The last thing I'd like to say, which is just putting my lawyer hat on, so to speak, as both of you said, MAP is the language, or the words of MAP are toxic, okay? I'm sorry about that, but if that's true, or I shouldn't say if it's true, since you said it. So I think we should think about alternative words. I actually went, for different reasons, went back and read Aristotle's Rhetoric, or portions of it, I should say, relatively recently, because I think rhetoric is very important. And one way to look at it is what we're looking at is having the alliance provide collective defense, or making Ukraine part of collective defense. So one option would be to have a Ukraine-NATO collective defense commitment. Now, I'm not saying that's the perfect set of wording, but what I want to do is ask the people who are both here at this table, General Jones and others, if the deficiency of a membership action plan partly lies in the rhetorical aspect, it's not foolish for people to start thinking about alternative sets of wordings and whether my Ukraine-NATO collective defense commitment is the right one or not. We need to think about that. So again, there are things to be done on the military side, illustratively ATACMS. There are things to be done on the geopolitical side, as was said, maintaining unity. And there are things to be done on the rhetorical side, because that rhetoric makes a difference in how people come to conclusions.
Mm-hmm. And importantly, for deterrence purposes as well.
And for deterrence purposes
specifically
as well.
looking at how Russia is going to be viewing this. So I want to take a step back. I think we talked a lot about some of the options so far, but the main argument, at least in my perspective, against inviting Ukraine formally to join the alliance is that some, if not most, of NATO members hope to avoid becoming a direct party to the war in Ukraine, and NATO as an organization is not a direct party to the conflict in Ukraine. The United States has drawn this as a sort of red line for itself as well. So I would ask each of you to comment on how you would address concerns that NATO could escalate this conflict with Russia if it enhances its military support, including providing weapons that could allow Ukraine to more easily target Russia from a safer standoff perspective, enhanced other military support, further enlargement of the alliance, and solidifying a plan for Ukraine to join the alliance. How would you make the argument that this would not escalate the conflict with Russia or bring NATO into the conflict with Russia? And then I have a kind of a follow-up question. I'm just always curious in all of these conversations. I think we talk a lot about what Russia is doing and how Putin is thinking. And I was having a conversation yesterday with one of our visiting fellows from Latvia who was making the very good point that Russia, and President Putin specifically, already views himself at war with the West and NATO, if not the United States specifically. So do you agree with this assumption that Putin already views himself at war with the U.S. and other NATO allies? And where does this kind of play into what Chris has already raised about self-deterrence? If NATO is already seen as a party in the conflict on the Russian side, how does that hold the argument that we should not invite Ukraine into the alliance now because that would drag NATO into the war? But that was a lot. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in most immediately. Maybe I'll turn to Chris.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, that is the concern on the Hill. Do you invoke in Article 5 the second?
And in the White House, I should say,
yes,
too, right?
Certainly.
That's,
do you invoke Article 5 the second they're a member of NATO if you were to bring them in right away? I think the paper addressed this issue actually very well in talking about you can get them ready for membership, but not yet because the ongoing conflict. I think that thinking through a mechanism to handle that is the most appropriate way, and I think would be much more comforting to, again, people on the Hill in that regard. I would say, however, that yes, Putin has always thought he's at war with the West. He's declared that for the last 15 years in speeches and other things. But I think we need to be careful that we don't take a Western view of the world and apply it to how Russia and specifically Putin thinks. He knows he can threaten nuclear use and get away with it. There is no cost to him. Whereas we would do a cost-benefit analysis on whether or not we would say those words, he doesn't. And so I think sometimes that rhetoric deters us a little bit more quickly than it should, because as we have given HIMARS, as we have given tanks, we don't see a commensurate response. We seem to have crossed a number of his red lines, but yet he has never acted. And so I think we need to analyze that a bit more and understand and appreciate what that means in terms of how much more support we could actually provide. I think if NATO as a collective military were to engage, I think that does change the dynamic for Putin, and I think we do need to be careful of that. But there is a lot of gap between what we're providing now and what that looks like, and I think we need to close that gap.
Yeah, Just to completely agree on the whole issue of Russia's calculus being totally different from ours. And we shouldn't make that mistake of sort of applying our calculus to theirs and then judging them by that. And you're right, they've been making threats throughout the war, before the war even, and yet nothing has happened in a way. So I don't want to say that we shouldn't take seriously some of the threats, but we shouldn't be afraid. And we shouldn't deter ourselves because of them. And as you said, Russia still thinks already now that they're at war with NATO. They're never going to like NATO. They didn't like NATO during the Soviet period. I mean, you know, they're not going to change their approach to NATO enlargement ever. So I don't think we should calculate on that. We have to keep in mind the end goal, which is a prosperous, secure, safe Ukraine. That's what we want in the end. And then we need to start thinking back from that. What are the steps we need to take? In Vilnius, the step we think we should take is put him on a path to membership. That's it. We're not talking about membership. We're not talking about any fast tracks. Just let's start with these steps. Let's do what we didn't do 15 years ago, which maybe we should have done, you know, in hindsight.
And that, I think, tracks a lot with how we've been thinking about the Vilnius summit. You know, there were a lot of things agreed to in Madrid and then obviously in Bucharest in 2008, but moving from these ideas to actually implementation across all of the NATO agenda, but this piece as well.
I think it's also important to say that there are risks of taking action, but there are risks of not taking action.
Exactly.
And for example, while at the moment I don't think most people think that Ukraine will, quote, lose the war in its entirety, I think it would be a very bad outcome if what happened was that the current situation remained, that is to say Russia in charge of, or whatever the right word is, controlling the Donbas area, the land bridge to Crimea, and Crimea. I don't think that is a positive at all for Europe in general, or for the United States, North America, Canada. So I think we have to calculate what the benefits are of doing more and what the losses would be if we didn't do more. And at the end of the day, it seems to me that Ukraine and the people in Ukraine have made a decision to want to be part of Europe. They have a constitutional amendment along those lines, if I recall correctly, that was put in place about 5 or 6 years ago. They've made the application and been granted candidacy in the European Union, which is enormously important in terms of working together. Obviously, they made the application to join NATO also, transatlantic. They are, as I mentioned, you know, you have a variety of leaders saying, you know, they're really fighting for us, as you said earlier. So I think we need to say to ourselves, you know, there are a lot of risks in not going forward, and life is not risk-free. At the end of the day, NATO, first and foremost, wants to be a deterrent. But you mentioned other things that are going on at Vilnius, and one of those is actually building regional plans to create military capabilities. If necessary, NATO is capable and meant to be capable of fighting. So I don't think we should say, oh no, we would never fight, because that's the wrong message to give. We certainly don't want to fight. That shouldn't be number one on the agenda. That's not my point. But I think if we don't challenge what Putin is doing, we will lose for all of us, not just for Ukraine.
I think especially in the context of areas where NATO has fought, and Afghanistan, Iraq, EU-led efforts in Mali, you know, these are all examples where coalitions were brought together under NATO or EU umbrellas that, you know, allies could choose what level of commitment to give to these NATO operations, I think, just as a point. But General Jones, please, if you could comment on my very large question of what would be the Russian response, and would NATO membership for Ukraine be escalatory, or how would you argue that it, you know, is something that wouldn't bring NATO directly into conflict with Russia? Oh, you're muted, so you might have to repeat the beginning there.
NATO historically has always been a defensive and somewhat reactive alliance that was the premise of the Cold War was one of deterrence and mutually assured destruction and all of that. And I think that with regard to Ukraine, that what NATO might do in the future is something that you don't want to take off the table, but I don't see that NATO will be the first to trigger a conflict with Russia. One of the things that I don't think is being talked about enough is what happens to Vladimir Putin when this is, regardless of what kind of result we achieve here at the end of the day. The president of China is watching very closely. Vladimir Putin has been declared a war criminal by the ICC. Does he resume at any time a welcome place in the international community and in the UN and other global meetings that are very important? What happens to him? And I think what happens to him is very, very important in Mr. President Xi's calculations as to whether he wants to do something like Vladimir Putin did in Ukraine, but in Taiwan. So how this ends is very important, and that's why I think that while the NATO accession treaty for Ukraine is important, the most important thing that's going on right now is on the ground, and to make sure that we do everything we can in a timely fashion with regard to the military fight that's about to take place with regard to the much talked about offensive. So I think the Putin equation of what happens to him in the future and how he's treated by the global community is also one of the factors that the President Xi Jinping is watching very closely.
That's great. Yep, please.
Yeah, thank you. Just to react on that, I mean, of course, I don't pretend to have any inside knowledge into what's going to happen with Putin, but certainly this links up very much to the issue of accountability. And this is something that we've also been pursuing. The Ukrainians have very actively been pursuing in parallel with fighting a war for their existence. They're also arguing that we need to look at the accountability piece of all of this. We need to make sure that all of the perpetrators of this crime of aggression are held accountable. And the work needs to start today and now so that we're ready for when the war ends. And I think 2014 is quite telling. And we should need to learn from those mistakes, maybe. Going back to business as usual with Russia, with Putin. I don't see how that's possible this time. I just don't. But that's maybe my own opinion.
Maybe even going back to 2008 as well.
Indeed,
there's,
yes. There's a pattern.
A pattern here.
Indeed.
And no one has been raising the alarm bells about that pattern more loudly than the Baltic nations, especially sharing a very close border with Russia and also the exclave of Kaliningrad and some of the capabilities that we think are housed there. I want to get to, we've talked a little bit, and maybe I'll pose this to Chris and maybe Frank, who can comment on the U.S. position on these issues. So there's been a lot of reporting on how the White House is considering this issue. Most recently, the New York Times had an article this morning that was quoting quite a few sources internal to the administration as well as external, that the U.S. president is not on board with extending a plan for membership to Ukraine at the NATO summit. A lot of Europeans are in favor of this. There was recently the letter by the foreign affairs chairman of many NATO allies, including Representative McCall on the House side, calling for this option at the summit and for leaders to adopt a path forward for Ukraine membership. Again, not something immediate, but something credible and on paper. Does the United States have a credibility problem going into the summit if they are allegedly the ones holding up a potential membership action plan or rebranded membership action plan?
You want to start?
The hot potato passes back and forth.
Well,
I'm happy to share my own thoughts on this, yes.
The president forgot to call me yesterday evening, so I don't
I
have
think he had a
the
root canal
absolute.
yesterday, so we can give him a.
I don't have the absolute latest, but I read the article also this morning, and that's consistent with what I've heard. Some people talk about the U.S. position as the so-called Israeli option, which is to say providing a lot of support.
The Israeli option for Ukraine.
The Israeli option for Ukraine. And what that really means is to provide a high degree of weaponry and capability over time. My own view, and we actually talk about it in the paper, is that option is insufficient for a variety of reasons. Among others, Israel's adversaries are fewer actually these days because of the Abraham Accords and other things. Israel's adversaries do not have nuclear weapons, and by contrast, Israel does. Israel has been able to win its wars. And so I think the Israeli option, or some version of it, is a poor choice. What I do think is starting a path, as we've all, I think, broadly agreed in this panel, is not the same as starting World War III. And so I think the United States position, as represented by, we'll call it the New York Times for the minute, is an overstatement. And I think from my perspective, my personal perspective, the U.S. needs to catch up with Europe. You mentioned the Foreign Affairs Chairman, parliamentary chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committees have a statement, and I think the wording they used actually was also path, if I recall correctly. So providing a path, I think, is really important. Again, as I said, the president doesn't call me, but the president is enormously experienced in transatlantic affairs. He's very much an Atlanticist. I'm a Democrat. I'm broadly supportive of what he does. I think that when he has the opportunity to speak with other leaders, that will be very, very important. And we've seen a change, I would say, in Europe of high consequence, and that was the speech that was recently given by President Macron. And without trying to quote it exactly, what President Macron said is we needed to give Ukraine a path. Yep. I think that President Biden will respect that position. He'll respect the position of each of the heads of states, the Baltics, of Poland, et cetera, UK. And I think that there, at least I'm guessing now, my hope is that there will turn out to be a compromise along the lines, perhaps utilizing some of the elements that we've laid out in this paper. They're designed to put a package together. We've seen the president be able to work domestically with people who disagree with him, most recently on the debt ceiling, where they started very far apart and then came out with, in my opinion, a pretty good solution. Same thing happened with respect to the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is really an energy and climate act, but in any event, started broadly separate and brought it together. So I'm hopeful, and maybe this is just unwarranted optimism, but my hope is that the president will take account of why Europe thinks this is so important, what the risks are, different than what that phrase, don't start World War III, because I don't think anyone is planning, to take steps to start World War III. So it seems to me that's an overstatement. So we'll see. At the end of the day, it's heads of state that have to make the decision.
I would add to that a little bit. I think when Europe is close to unanimity on its own, ignoring that is dangerous. And I think in the NATO context, that is particularly true as we try to show Russia a unanimous position regarding Ukraine. So I think the administration would do well to think very deeply about something more substantive in terms of what would come out of the summit in that regard. I think also we need to take a step back and view the longer picture here a little bit. There is an immediate crisis, obviously, in Ukraine and in the war with Russia, but there is the larger European security architecture over the next 10 to 15, 20 years. And if we haven't thought about what if the United States needs to pull out to deal with the Taiwan crisis, and what does that do to European security? If 5 years from now this war is resolved and Ukraine is in NATO, then you have a robust military that can continue to help provide some of those security components that Europe wants and needs. If we don't think about that long-term piece in the midst of this conversation, then I think we're doing a little bit of malpractice to the whole of collective defense in Europe.
I think this is something that, especially in the context of U.S. policy towards China and the assumptions that the United States would make based on how Europeans would support, increased deterrence efforts in the Indo-Pacific and even just in the medium term, not even the long term, ensuring that the United States is aligned with where Europeans are, where it seems like there's consensus being reached. So, General Jones, did you want to come into this on this question, and then I think I'll ask kind of about broader alliance credibility, not to put you on the spot commenting on one specific ally, but how you're viewing the credibility of NATO as an alliance and as a military alliance and deterrence effort if there aren't steps taken on this specific question of the path. General Jones, did you want to chime in?
Well, very briefly, I think that what's happened as a result of Vladimir Putin's mistaken belief that the West was soft and in particular the United States would not be able to react to the invasion is a gross miscalculation on his part, the likes of which we haven't seen in a long, long time. So from my standpoint, as a former NATO commander, but also as someone who grew up in post-war Europe, my family lived in Europe for 27 years, starting in 1946. I am really pleased with NATO's reaction at the Munich Security Conference in February of this year. I was stunned at the rhetoric in support of Ukraine and against the Russian invasion. There were some words that were spoken that bode very well, I think, for the future of NATO. And I think that NATO is back as strong as ever with the membership now reaching numbers that we never thought possible just a few years ago. So I think we can be proud of the linkage between the United States and our European friends and allies. And on the question of accession into NATO for Ukraine, I think they'll find the right phraseology and the right words to give Ukraine assurances that it's going to happen, but it's going to happen at the right time and at the right place. And there are some things that have to happen now. And I mentioned again the war on the ground as it's currently unfolding is really critical to whatever happens downrange within the rest of this year.
And I think there are many who would share that optimism that, the wordsmithing that happens on these communiques up until the very last minute, especially when we're talking about such a complex issue that has huge ramifications for the future of transatlantic security and global security. But could I ask you to comment on, so reporting has and private conversations that we've been having at the Atlantic Council have indicated, as you've already pointed out, that one of the options that there's unanimity on right now within the alliance is, of course, increased monetary support, potentially using common funding options, but something that's multi-year. I was seeing numbers of $500 million per year that would be multi-year, as well as transitioning the NATO-Ukraine, I always get this mixed up, the NATO-Ukraine Commission to a NATO-Ukraine Council, which would formalize a political relationship and kind of a quasi-Article 4 allow Ukraine to also call members together of the alliance and have a seat at the table when and if it needs to. So that sort of more formalized agreement. If those are the only things that are agreed to at the NATO summit, how do you think that that would be read by the Ukrainians, by the Russians? Does it undermine NATO's credibility as an alliance? I know obviously where you stand on the issue of a path towards membership, but if that's the bare minimum that allies are able to agree to, where does that leave us?
Yeah, I think it would undermine, unfortunately, the credibility. I really do. And this is, there's 4 weeks left. There's not a lot of time, but there's sufficient time, I think, to reach that unity and consensus on this issue. And this is one of the messages that we've been giving for the past months, is that this is not an issue that's going to go away. So we have to start the discussion. Fortunately, now we started. Foreign ministers met in Oslo a few weeks ago, had a good discussion. So I think we're on the way, but what we don't want is, I think, to put it bluntly, a discussion among leaders at Vilnius on such an important issue. NATO summits generally are, I don't want to say pre-agreed, but most of the difficult issues are sort of discussed and decided on before the summit, so that you don't go into the summit with sort of really big loose ends that need to be discussed. So I hope so, because I think this is a big credibility issue. And I think we've done so well on NATO unity. As General said, NATO's back, and NATO's strong, NATO's united, and it would just be a shame if this issue, which I think has been thought to be, it's made into too big a thing in a way. It is a big issue, but after all, what we're talking about is some language. It's setting out a path, and that's it. We're not talking about membership. So I think it's really important. But there are just a couple of other issues I want to mention with Vilnius that also I think are important for credibility of NATO. One is defense spending. We're in a totally, as I said before, new situation. We have a war in Europe. The alliance has made a lot of really important decisions on bolstering defense, the defense especially of the eastern flank, but also of the whole alliance. And now that sort of, from our perspective, needs to be also backed up with some serious decisions, commitments anyway, on defense spending. We're reaching the 10-year mark since the Wales Defense Investment Pledge, and we need to look at that again. Otherwise, it's not credible what we're saying. We have plans, but are we going to be able to meet them, to defend every inch, as has been mentioned?
I think one of the things that I do want to get into, and then we have a lot of audience questions that are already coming in, but just for the virtual audience, we can continue to collect questions on askac.org, so askac.org. And then for the in-person audience, once we get to a few more minutes in, you can gesture towards my colleagues who are around the room in prominent places and head up towards the microphone, and we can call a question on camera. But I think before we kind of get to some of the audience questions, something that has been, I think, in a lot of headlines, and Frank, you've already talked about this, is the so-called Israel model, which I think is also a potential horrible branding situation that we've gotten into. But I think looking beyond just membership options, but also looking at security guarantees and ways that NATO and NATO allies can, multilaterally as well as bilaterally better secure Ukraine and enable, to what Chris has also discussed about this long-term need to bolster Ukraine's defenses and ability to counter Russia. Could I ask you to comment, Frank, on this Israel model option? What do you think that means when we hear officials talking about the Israel model? And then I think I know where you come down on this, but maybe looking specifically at options that NATO could take that are short of, again, what Chris was saying, this maximum option of membership, and then, this maximum option of NATO, entering the conflict directly, and what we're providing now. There's a lot of different options, and I'd just be curious to kind of tease out some more tangible recommendations. I feel like the conversations don't drill into the details enough when we talk about these things. So some ideas, for example, that have been floated are NATO training missions that are, again, under the NATO umbrella that happen actually on Ukraine's territory. So outside of the alliance territory. And I think there are ways that you could build in rules of engagement if they were under attack, et cetera. We have examples, again, from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Mali, as well as increased military assistance, of course, and something that's more set in stone and year after year funding, again, looking at the Israel model. But that's a lot. There's a lot, I think, that is implied in the Israel model, but I don't think has been sort of unpacked, and I know you have some thoughts on it.
Well, first of all, I worked a great deal with Israel a couple of times. I was in the administration, so they're getting a bad rap by having this model be utilized. Our relationship, U.S. relationship, as many other countries with Israel, is really outstanding, and it's what we want. So, but we don't want the same thing for Ukraine. That's the real point. And the difference, and I'll say it again, Israel has capabilities that Ukraine is not going to have, not least of which is its nuclear capabilities. It has treaties with its neighbors. It has treaties with Jordan, with Egypt, et cetera. It has the Abraham Accords, which has reduced considerably tensions with a number of Gulf countries, for example, the UAE. And I saw, though, Secretary of State Blinken is seeking to have Saudi Arabia, so to speak, become a member, if not directly, of the Abraham Accords to work out arrangements with Israel. So the calculations there are quite different. But I think what can be done and what should be understood is we were doing a lot, by which I mean NATO and NATO countries, with Ukraine from the period 2014 until the war. There were missions, training missions inside of Ukraine. There were lots of sets of activities and ongoing, and this is all from public information. Right now, NATO countries are providing so-called intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, so-called targeting information, providing lots of money, of course, as has already been mentioned, actual munitions. So how to plus it up, I think, is a difficult question, but I think to understand where I'm coming from, before the war, so it was December 2021, I actually wrote a piece that said, and the conversation then was a lot about sanctions, and my piece, the headline was more or less, Ukraine needs military support as well as sanctions. And so I think we need to think our way through how to provide more military support. And I think at the moment, it's not doable because countries do not want to put their forces inside Ukraine. That's understandable. But there are some things that could be done, I think. We've mentioned more weapons. And I think the other thing that could be done, which would be a strong signal to our support for Ukraine and important, is there's about $300 billion in Russian assets that is held by, and it turns out actually mostly in Belgium, but also by some other countries. It's in a particular bank account, so to speak. It's not a bank account in Belgium. I think those assets should be seized. And I think there are sort of two elements to that. One, there's a concern about international law, and the second, the concern about whether there's an actual statute that allows seizure within the country. There are a lot of conversations about this, and the European Union has a working group on it. Mm-hmm. My own view is that as part of collective defense, and we are supporting Ukraine effectively through collective defense with what we're doing, that one can not only provide weapons, but one can also provide financial support, and part of that financial support could be the seizure of these assets, whether in Belgium or the United States or otherwise. In the U.S., we would have to have a new statute, I think, although some people say to the contrary, but I think the Congress probably would support a statute. That's a guess. But
We might see something tomorrow.
We might, and so the point of
please.
Yeah, I'll stop talking because we're getting a revelation here. So the point I'm making is that I think we need to look for things that really make a difference. Seizing the $300 billion in assets would really make a difference. And if I'm correct, and I'm relying actually on an Atlantic Council colleague who really digs into these things, who's both written and told me that that's where most of the money is. If Belgium would create the appropriate statute, or alternatively the EU could create a framework statute, and then so that we're all together, so to speak, I think that would be extremely important. And then I do think that if it turns out that Ukraine doesn't do as well as we hope it does, and I certainly then I think we should look hard about whether or not we should actually provide some, what would be called from a military point of view, supporting approaches inside of Ukraine. That would be a very big issue. But whether, and I would be thinking about logistics, basically, those kinds of things. But I think it's important for the overall security and stability of the transatlantic countries, as well as what's been mentioned with respect to the Indo-Pacific and the implications, as Chris has pointed out, that we have a victory here. And so, again, to me, there are clearly risks. I don't want to minimize the risks, but there are risks in the Cold War. Jim was a Cold Warrior, me too. And I think you have to evaluate the risks versus the benefits. And I think the benefits of supporting Ukraine to make sure it does win are worth the risks.
I think it's, again, to this credibility question, what is NATO willing to fight for as an alliance? I think there are a lot of nations individually who are ready to step up bilaterally. And I joke all the time that I would go to the front lines, but I don't think the Ukrainian military needs my specific skill set of policy analysis and moderating events. But if anyone is hiring.
I've sent your name in. But the one thing that is also worth saying is when one looks at the actual Article 5 in NATO, it says an attack on one is an attack on all. That's automatic. But then it goes on to say that if that happens, countries should decide, or individually and collectively, what they want to do. So there's no clear requirement for the North Atlantic Council to provide now we're all going, because it's individualized. And there's no clear requirement as to actually what would be done. Now, obviously, we've spent, since, trying to remember, 1949, when NATO was created, generating a collective response, and that would be the ideal response. But it's certainly possible under the wording of the treaty and the like for nations to take alternative approaches. And we've seen some of that actually in some of the missions that you mentioned. You mentioned Afghanistan. We went into Afghanistan with different rules of engagement. That was not a good idea from a military point of view, but it was important to get the countries there. So in the overall, we took the downside of different rules of engagement for the geopolitical benefit of acting together. So there are ways to have even Ukraine in, and then let's just hypothetically say that Russia kept up what I'll call low-level activities, across the border or whatever. Then yes, that would technically trigger Article 5, but then what one does with respect to it would still be an open question.
Right. Nothing is automatic.
It's not automatic. It might
allies.
be decided to be collectively, but it's not by the treaty. Is my point.
General Jones, I might ask you, I think you're muted, but just to chime in, I think from your perspective as formerly head of U.S. European Command and SACEUR, are there options that you think that the alliance can be considering from a military perspective to deepen its relationship with Ukraine on that mil-mil level? So again, coming back to this idea of training missions that actually occur on Ukrainian soil. I think that there's also a lot of room for NATO to open the aperture on what sort of support it's providing from the NATO perspective. As of right now, the NATO alliance does not actually provide support to Ukraine that is lethal assistance. That is all done bilaterally. So General Jones, over to you. And then we'll turn to an in-person audience question.
Back in the early 2000s, when the NATO-Russia Council was up and operating and the NATO-Ukraine Council was functioning, and there was a moment in time when we actually were having very good relations with the Russian military as well as the Ukrainian military. And we had exchanges of military capabilities in Yukon and in Russia. I was invited to visit the Russian missile defense capability surrounding Moscow. There was a lot of good things going on, and Russia made a choice, and Ukraine made a choice in those days that have consequences that are now apparent on the battlefield. And the choices were that Ukraine did in fact accept Western military coaching, if you will, and the Russians did not. And as a result, there was a lot of surprise voices at the performance of the Ukrainian military vis-a-vis the Russians in the early days of the war. But for those who really knew what transpired back in the early 2000s, where a clear choice was made, for instance, the Russian military doesn't have the equivalent of jointness, so to speak. They don't have NCOs. They don't give the NCOs the authority that the Western powers give them. And the Ukrainians really spent a lot of time redesigning their forces and redesigning their philosophy in warfighting. And as a result, you see the difference in the performance. I think the Russian casualties are 5 times what the Ukrainian casualties are. I did want to comment a little bit on the Israeli model. I think those that are advocating that Israel serve as a model for Ukraine's position in the European security architecture are confusing 2 really different geopolitical alignments. Israel's adversaries are a disorganized, somewhat discombobulated set of countries. They're not unified. Some are relatively poor. Some have been defeated by Israel's armed forces. And all of them are, at least for now, non-nuclear. By contrast, in Russia, we have a unitary entity. Its economic magnitude dwarfs that of Ukraine, and its population is 3.5 times that of Ukraine. And I think the Russian determination to defeat Ukraine dwarfs the intensity of the Arab world's intentions regarding Israel. And lastly, secondly, Israel is a nuclear power. Let's not forget that point. Following 1994, the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine will not forget that point, I can tell you that. Thank you.
And I think to defend a little bit too, the Israel model is used in a specific way to discuss how the United States would bilaterally better secure Ukraine's defenses. So bilateral agreements. What I like about the Israel model is that Israel is striking far into adversary territory and not getting yelled at by U.S. officials publicly. So I think that's maybe something that should be on the table going into the summit. But I'll turn to our in-person audience question. Sir, if you could please introduce yourself and then pose your question.
John Roberts. I'm a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council, UK-based. Quick question is, how much do you think the path towards Ukrainian membership of NATO needs to be absolutely settled before the next American elections in November next year? Secondly, does the issue of recession in Europe, with Germany in recession, France on the brink, UK also on the brink, impact on defense spending, the commitments to developing NATO, or potentially might this prove to be a fuel for defense spending-led economic recovery?
Great questions. I think, Frank, I'll ask you to chime in first, and then I think especially the U.S. election question, I'll maybe ask Chris to comment on.
I'm going to let Chris handle the U.S. election.
All right, the hot potato is passed appropriately.
But, well, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in the election. There's, as people have noticed, the currently leading Republican candidate has been indicted twice in the last few months. So what that all means, it's just quite uncertain were he to become the candidate and then win. I just think it's quite unclear. But Chris,
unprecedented, at least.
Right, unprecedented. But on the recession question, I think that I'd make 2 points. One, in the large countries in Europe, and by that, and I may be leaving somebody out, but France, Germany, UK, Poland, and I'm not exactly sure where Italy is at this point. But the four I mentioned have all undertaken or said they'll undertake to spend a great deal more money than they have been. So the polls plan to go up to approximately 4% of GDP, if I recall correctly. The French Parliament just passed, it's not all the way through the Parliament if I understand their process right, but just passed a very expanded set of spending requirements for the French military. UK in its recent so-called integrated review refresh, that is to say their national security strategy, put 2.5% as the goal. And the Germans, of course, have their $100 billion fund, and they're sorting out exactly what to do to add to that. So we have, I think, a commitment for a lot of money coming from the large countries. Then there are smaller countries, obviously Estonia and some others, the Baltics for sure, that are also committing. The absolute numbers are not high, but the abilities, let me say that differently, the capabilities that can actually be acquired, even with small amounts, especially these days when there are commercial capabilities that carry over very well, are very important and would be highly valuable for defense. And then, so I think, to answer the question directly, I certainly am not in charge of the politics in any of these countries, but I think that there's been a bulwark against the impact of the recession. And lastly, I would point out that although it's technically not allowed, if I understand correctly, under the EU Constitution, the EU has figured out with the ammunition activity and certain others how to actually create a military set of related budgets. I hope it'll do more also on military mobility, which will be very important. So I think we have a good likelihood of Europe doing enough. I think the place where it might turn out to be less certain would be actually on reconstruction. But that's down the road a bit. And then the U.S., I think a lot probably, in fact, will turn on the election, but I leave that to Chris.
I think I'll turn to Kilika first if you want to comment on this defense spending question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, of course, the recession needs to be taken into account, and the fiscal situation in every country is of course key, but I think it's a question of prioritizing. And I agree that many European allies have prioritized security already as the key issue, but we're not there yet. And I think there's still some countries where they haven't sort of made that shift to a wartime sort of mentality in a way, what is needed actually. So I think there's still some steps to be taken when times were good. Then also we saw some allies not spending, not meeting the defense investment pledge commitments. Now that times are not so good, then again you get into the same discussion. But I think it's certainly necessary. And I just, when it comes to Germany, because Germany's often criticized, I think, for being slow. I mean, I think from our perspective, actually, they've made an incredible shift. I mean, 180 degrees, and now really doubling down on spending and making a huge effort. So I think that also has to be taken into account. And as you said, there are other allies, France doing a lot, UK. So I think overall the trend is good, but of course it always helps to have, how do I say, U.S. leadership on this issue, which we would like to see even more of, I think.
I think, Chris, if you could comment, should we be looking at the timeline also considering where the U.S. could be in 2024?
Yeah, I don't really think that the issue of Ukraine membership in NATO is a presidential election issue. I think there's a broader question of support for the war in Ukraine itself, but membership I don't think really needs to be resolved. And as we've talked here, we're talking about a path to membership. We're not talking about a specific membership in 18 months or anything. So, but speaking a little bit more broadly on the question, I think one of the things that we've been talking about in the alliance for over a decade now, but certainly something that Ukraine is driven home, is the lack of defense spending in Europe as a whole. and the need to bolster that. I think one of the things that Ukraine has also showed, both for the US as well as for Europe, is the lack of investment in defense industry and the ability to rapidly produce equipment for a conflict situation. And so there's certainly a need for more defense spending, but there's also a need to look at how do you rejuvenate the defense industry in the transatlantic relationship to be able to support that. And I think that is something that, while it has been discussed, I know the Pentagon has looked at this a little bit. I think there is not a sense of urgency in that where there should be. And I think if we do it wisely, we could potentially integrate U.S. and European defense industry a bit more to increase production and to be able to help everyone in that. That may help if there's a recession in Europe to some extent as well. But again, I think we need to take a very strong look at how we reform industry to be able to help facilitate these fights. We see this in the production of Stingers and Javelins and some of the other very important equipment in Ukraine. And I always continue to think through that competition with China. If we were to have a Ukraine and Taiwan simultaneously, I'm not sure our industry is prepared to be able to support that, and we need to fix that.
I think we have a related question from the audience, and I might ask General Jones to comment on it, especially with his business perspective. But a question from Nate Lamar, who's the Director of International Business Development at GM Defense, arguing he claims, for NATO to function efficiently, protectionism of its various defense industries must end, especially the provision of military aid and equipment to Ukraine needs to continue. How do you see such protectionism ending, or maybe potentially more positive? What are some of the steps that you think NATO as an alliance, General Jones, could be taking to enable this transatlantic industrial cooperation beyond just breaking down our own issues at our national levels?
Well, I think one of the historical problems in NATO has been how rapidly NATO can buy the things that it needs in order to advance itself in terms of military capability. I want to just make a comment on the last question, and that is that I honestly believe that the Ukrainian destiny will be settled before the U.S. elections. I think what happens this year is absolutely critical. Hopefully, Ukraine can win, and we can talk about what that means. But it's very important that Ukraine be perceived by everyone to be successful here, and I think that everything else flows from that. If Ukraine is not seen to be successful, and again we talk about what that means, then I think you have a whole different kettle of fish here in terms of the amount of support that will come to Ukraine, despite the promises made at the Munich Security Conference. I've been around long enough to know that those hold for a while, but not forever. So what's going on in Ukraine right now militarily on the ground is, to me, the most important thing. And good things can flow from success if that happens, and we should do everything we can to make sure that it does happen.
Mm-hmm. I think we have a couple of related questions from the audience that I want to put together and have everyone respond to in 20 seconds. So from Steve Shapiro, who's a senior advisor here at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, as well as from Ian Bond, who is the director of foreign policy at the Center for European Reform, both asking related questions. If membership in NATO for Ukraine is tied to the war ending, does that just prolong the war because Russia is not incentivized to end the conflict or agree to a ceasefire?
If it were put exactly in those terms, the answer would be yes. But if one talks about instead as a path to membership that takes account of what happens in the future, then one could say, well, Ukraine has succeeded apropos what Jim is saying. Russia is decisively defeated, we hope. And then Russia tries to keep things going. I think that in those circumstances, it would make sense to bring Ukraine in, assuming that the other conditions are met, such as they are.
I agree with that.
Thank you, General Jones.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think we should avoid timelines at this point in time. You know, the situation being so fluid, none of us knowing what will happen, you know, tomorrow, next week, next month. I think we should just avoid timelines at the moment.
I think Chris, briefly.
I'd share what Frank said. NATO understands how to work this. West Germany was brought in without having its borders fully defined the way it wanted to either.
Great. Well, thank you so much all for a really great discussion, our in-person panelists, as well as General Jones joining us virtually. And thank you again to our partners at the Estonian Embassy on this event and our ongoing other areas of collaboration. So for those who joined us in person, thank you for joining our virtual audience as well. Asked a lot of great questions that we didn't get to, but stay tuned. We'll be doing a lot more programming as the Atlantic Council in the lead up to the Vilnius summit. And I would like to now turn to conclude our event to Ambassador Dan Fried. Ambassador Fried, in the course of his 40-year Foreign Service career, has played a key role in designing and implementing American policy in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. Ambassador Fried has served as a special assistant and senior director at the National Security Council in the White House for Presidents Clinton and Bush. He was also ambassador to Poland and assistant secretary of state for Europe from 2005 to 2009. So he's helped craft policy on NATO enlargement specifically to Central Europe and worked closely on NATO-Russia relations and has really helped to lead the West's response to Moscow's aggression in Georgia, in Ukraine, and beyond. And we're very pleased to have him joining us in person today to share his reflections in advance of the 2023 NATO summit in Vilnius. Ambassador Fried, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I've got two thoughts, one big, one specific. The big thought is everything we've been discussing here this morning is the latest chapter in a strategic dilemma that the United States and Europe have dealt with since the fall of the Soviet and, in fact, the Russian Empire in Europe, which is what happens to the countries, to the European countries liberated by that fall. Do they become part of our family, or do we assign them to some sort of gray zone and a Moscow sphere of influence? This is what we've had to grapple with for 30 years. George H.W. Bush said that we sought after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a Europe whole and free. President Clinton set out to make that a reality. What he tried to do was reach out to a Russia for whom we had greater hopes, and to help enlarge the European family with NATO enlargement as the leading edge, and EU enlargement followed. Now, that policy was debated at the time, and in recent weeks and months, I've heard arguments which recall those debates from 30 years ago, but applied to Ukraine instead of Poland and the Baltic states. It's too provocative to Russia to have them as part of our family. It overextends us. They're not really our sort. I've heard the same arguments, some of them pretty bad, from 30 years ago. But the fact is, while our hopes for a better relationship with a better Russia didn't work out, our hopes for a united Europe really did work out. That's 100 million Europeans from the Baltic to the Black Sea, part of NATO and the European Union. And if they have political problems and economic challenges, well, so do we. As an American, I'm hardly in a place to lecture anybody else about challenges to democracy. We all have to do better. We all have to live up to our best national traditions and not those other national traditions. That's the large context of this discussion about Ukraine's future. Is Ukraine part of our extended European and transatlantic family, or is it not? And if it isn't, what are the consequences? And to put it clearly and bluntly, gray zones mean green lights for you-know-who. At the end of this phase of the conflict, Ukraine will still be standing with all of its territory returned or most of its territory. What then? This discussion has urged, and the panelists were right, that Ukraine be treated as a European country with European aspirations and a European future. Meaning, bring them into NATO, bring them into the European Union. Yes, easier said than done, but you have to say it and you have to mean it. Now, that's not easy. And it's especially not easy when there's a war on, but the key issue at the Vilnius summit will be, do we mean it? Do we mean that Europe, whole and free, is still an objective? And is Ukraine, in concept, part of that family? And we actually decided this in principle at Bucharest. I was at the Bucharest NATO summit. It was a mess. I mean, it was just as bad as you've read about. But one good thing came out of it. There was agreement that the end state was Ukraine and Georgia in NATO. Now, Georgia's government is busy taking itself out of the running for that. That's happily not our discussion today. But that endpoint was decided amid all the rancor about what it meant. We have an agreed NATO position on where we're going. Then the question, and this is my more specific thought, not the big thought, is how we get there. And you've heard in this discussion various good ways to do it. No, it won't do simply to repeat the Bucharest formula. And I think the US government is slowly, a little too slowly, coming around to that realization. The Central and East Europeans, who know perfectly well what being in a gray zone might mean, have been pushing the US government, both publicly and privately, to keep moving. That pressure can be a good thing. The Poles and the Czechs pressured the Clinton administration in '93 and '94, and it had a good impact because President Clinton was listening. I suspect that Frank Kramer is right, that President Biden is also listening. I think the pressure will have a good impact, and that the Vilnius summit will, I hope, but I am reasonably confident that it will go beyond Bucharest and try to fill in the gap between where we are now and the ultimate objective of Ukraine and NATO, and fill it in with practical steps to keep Ukraine secure, but steps on the way to that secure end state. I wish we weren't dealing with the impact of the fall of the Russian Empire and Putin's attempt to restore it, but it doesn't matter what I want. We and everybody else and 45 million Ukrainians have to deal with Russia's war and the consequences, and we need to face up to our responsibilities. Peace will not be achieved the easy way. It will be achieved the hard way and the lasting way, and that means bringing in NATO, timing and means to be determined, but bringing in Ukraine into our NATO family. So thanks very much for the opportunity to sum this up. This was a great discussion, learned a lot, and, well, fingers crossed, and keep up, and to the Central and East Europeans and the Estonians, keep up the pressure. We need it. Thank you.